Hello everyone. Before doing a time lapse today, I wanted to show you a little bit about color mixing and how to get started. When we're looking at the still life, and I'm going to start with that orange there on the far left, I would suggest coming up with a strategy so that you have a plan of attack to do your painting. You're going to look for the mass tone, the mass hue. So looking at the local color of the orange, for instance, stick with one color at first and paint that entire thing solid, and then move on to the highlights, the shadows, that sort of thing. And in terms of a strategy, one thing that you might do is what I encourage is to work from light to dark. So I'm going to start with my orange, then my green, then peach, then mango, to go in order of light to dark. If you kind of squint at that, the orange, you squint at it as the lightest object there. That way, if I need to change things as I go, if I make something too light or too dark, it's a little bit easier to correct course than if you, say, started with the darkest object or the middle object. The other thing that I want you to think about is maybe you work from left to right or from to the bottom to the top, that sort of thing as well as you work through your still life, but come up with one strategy. So I have my palette that I opened up. It had that wet paper towel, it had saran wrap around it, and so this paint is all still good. I added a little bit more to it. I'm going to try to mix that orange value here and give you some tips as well for this. So try to be consistent with how you mix the color. Remember before I showed you drawing a little Sharpie line on the palette knife so that you could remember, say, this is 3 parts yellow, 2 parts red, that sort of thing as you start to mix. And you can hold up the color like that to see kind of where you're at. I'm going to add a little bit more yellow here before I add a touch of white. Kind of try to get it in the color range first, and then get it in the value range second. So this looks pretty good. Maybe it's still a touch too orange. Add a little bit more yellow. I've also got a little bit of blue mixing in there, just to dull it down a little bit. I'm going to add some white. And one thing is I'm mixing it in part of the orange, but not all of it, just to see what it does, and then I'll fold it in and mix it with the entire thing. That way you don't have to, say, start over. When you feel like you get pretty close, that's too much blue that's mixing in with that. When you feel like you've gotten pretty close, this isn't quite there yet. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little bit of my paint. I'm going to do what's called a drag down, and I'm going to drag it against this little white sheet of paper here. You could also use a piece of paper from your sketchbook and leave this as notes, and you could write what you've done. But now I'm going to go compare this to the orange itself. And when I squint, I notice it's pretty good. Actually, it's pretty good for part of the peach or part of the mango. When I squint it and look at this, it's still a little bit too orange. So I'm going to add a little bit more yellow and a little bit more white to it. And if I needed to, I could take some of this, and in other words, if I were to add yellow and white to this, it would probably take a lot of white and a lot of yellow to shift it much. So what I can do is I can take a little bit of this orange, say like this, move it over here so it's not the entire section, add some yellow to it, add a little bit of white to it, mix that up. And my guess is this is going to be a lot closer now. Mix this up. And what you're going to do now is you're going to have these two colors side by side. Do a little bit of a drag down right next to it, like so. You got those two colors side by side, and then come up here and compare it, and voila. Fairly brilliant, pretty close. And now I'm going to take this color once it's evenly mixed, and I'm going to cover my orange here, keeping in mind that we want this to be flat at first when we look at the orange or even the peach by example next to it. There's some areas that are lighter, there are some areas that are darker, but I'm just going to go with everything first. And you'll notice some of the blue peeks through that. That's okay, that's good, I want that because I can use that to my advantage. The other thing I want you to think about is using the direction of the orange itself. So think about how that orange curves. In other words, just don't paint up and down like this, but rather as you're painting, try to mimic the way that the orange curves three-dimensionally to form a solid spherical shape. So I'm just going to fill this in here. Not really worried about shading at this point. But just filling the solid orange like so. If you squint at that and I look up and I look down, I still think this is a little light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust this color a little bit, even though it looked good. You know, if I make this solid like right here, it looks, if you squint at that, it looks fairly good, but it's still a little on the light side. If you compare it to this and how it blends in, maybe it's good there, maybe it's good there, but for this part it's a little bit lighter. So I'm going to make this a touch darker, and then I'm going to proceed from light to dark with this, and then I'm going to do a time lapse so you can see how this develops. And then after the time lapse, giving all of these the solid kind of mass tone, local color, then I'm going to show you another technique of how to dry brush and how to glaze. So that'll be part 2 and 3.